Welcome to the June meeting of the Washington County Water Consortium for 2023. My name is Tom Dietrich. I'm a water resource planner with Washington County Public Health and Environment, and I, along with my colleague Angela Deffenbaugh from the Washington Conservation District, host this monthly meeting to gather public and private partners to share ideas, information, updates, and lessons learned on any and all topics under the umbrella of water resources. So our topic this month centers around habitat and wetland restoration efforts, and we've got three great speakers for you today. Two are joining us from the Friends of the Mississippi River, and one from our very own Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District. So at the top this afternoon, we'll hear from Alex Roth, Land Conservation Director, and Laura Domiancic-Lee, ecologist, both with Friends of the Mississippi River. And then they'll be providing us with an intro and overview of FMR's land conservation program and telling us about habitat restoration work in Washington County. Then rounding out this afternoon, we'll hear from Mike Kinney, the district administrator with Comfort Lake Forest Lake, who will be telling us about the use of sequential diagnostic monitoring to identify nutrient sources around Bone Lake that ultimately led to a wetland restoration. So before we get started this afternoon, I did just want to briefly mention that if you have any topic ideas or have a presentation yourself, please feel free to reach out to either Angela or myself. We're always looking for new topics or ideas to share with the group. Also, just a quick note and a reminder that we will not be having a July meeting of the consortium just due to the first Wednesday of next month falling on July 5th. So instead, keep your eyes out for a survey that Angela and I will be sending out. We're going to be polling our audience on a variety of different things, from topic selection, meeting length, and meeting format moving forward, whether that's in-person, virtual, or hybrid. So our first speakers this afternoon are Alex Roth, Land Conservation Director, and Laura Domiancic-Lee, ecologist, both with FMR. And I've had the distinct pleasure of knowing and working with Alex and Laura for the better part of the last 10 years. And I'm very excited to have them both with us this afternoon. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Alex and Laura, who will be providing us with an introduction and overview of restoration sites in Washington County. Take it away, Alex and Laura.
All right, great. Thank you, Tom. I think Laura's pulling up our presentation here and it's going to kind of drive things, but it's really nice to be here. Thank you for having us, and nice to see some familiar names here. But I wanted to make sure that everybody's familiar with FMR. So I'm going to start with a bit of an intro before we get into covering our specific restoration sites in the county. So again, my name is Alex Roth, Conservation Director at FMR. I'm here with Laura Domiancic-Lee, one of our ecologists. And let's dive right into FMR. So if folks aren't familiar, FMR is a nonprofit. It's based in St. Paul. And the mission is really to engage people to protect, restore, and enhance the Mississippi River and its watershed in the Twin Cities. We were founded in 1993, sort of as a citizen voice for the river, and we're associated with the stretch of the river that's the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, or MNRA. So now we're in our 30th year of doing this work. And folks kind of know our interrelated programs. You may have interacted with us in one way or another, but people are often surprised about kind of the breadth of our work. So we do really intentional, local, community-based stewardship and planning work, to more regional conservation and restoration work, all the way up to statewide water policy work. And so we've got these four main program areas. I'll briefly touch on each one. We're going to be focusing today, obviously, on our land conservation program, but we've got a land use and planning team that really works on ensuring that development and land use policies along the river both sort of respect the scenic views and values of the river and also result in equitable access to the river. We've got a water program that works on statewide water quality policies, things like the state's buffer rule, bans on triclosan and microplastics, nutrient standards, invasive carp regulations, as well as more recently perennial ag work through our partnership with the University of Minnesota's Forever Green program. And then we've got our stewardship and education program. That staff engages about 3,000 to 5,000 people a year in public and group volunteering and education events, in youth programming, both in classroom and through our Environmental Stewardship Institute. That's a paid program for high schoolers to gain experience with environmental topics and organizations. And then last but not least, our land conservation program, which we are here representing today. So our land conservation program, we don't own any land, we partner with landowners, and that might be state agencies like the Minnesota DNR, might be cities, counties, corporations, and private landowners, with the goal of protecting and restoring habitat for the benefits of water quality, wildlife, and human uses. And what does that mean? That sounds a little broad. We kind of have 3 to 4 main components to our program's work. We've got planning, and this can be planning on sort of a metro-wide scale, things like the Metro Conservation Corridors. That's a network of preferred conservation and restoration sites throughout the Twin Cities that FMR was involved in creating about 20 years ago. It's kind of that light green color on the map on the left side of the slide. We do site-specific management planning. We've written about 80 natural resource management plans that guide restoration of sites throughout the Twin Cities, both specific sites as well as greenways and other components of larger scale planning. And then most recently, we've started a new initiative, especially in our urban core sites, of this sort of volunteer-centric management planning, where we're creating plans for volunteers that give community organizations the tools and the knowledge to take care of their own sort of backyard habitats in their own local parks. So that's an interesting new thrust of our work. We also do a fair bit of protection work. We work again with public and private landowners to get land into public ownership or to protect its natural features through easements. We've purchased and protected property that has resulted in the creation of 3 scientific and natural areas, 2 DNR wildlife management areas, conservation areas, and lots of county and board held easements. And then we do quite a bit of restoration. We kind of consider this the bread and butter of our program and what we're going to focus on today. We really focus on restoring and enhancing important habitat. We use science-based criteria to decide where we're working. We currently have 42 active restoration sites through in the Twin Cities Metro. You can see on that map on the left, which we will zoom in on, don't worry if you can't read it. Those red polygons are the sites that we currently work at. These sites range in size from 2-acre prairie installs with the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board up to 1,200-acre conservation areas and wildlife management areas. So we're restoring about 2,000 acres a year. We do forest and prairie restoration primarily. We work also on savanna, wetland, and riverine, stream bank, and shoreline habitat restoration. And then lastly, as part of this, we want to make sure that the restorations are having their intended effects, both on water quality as well as on wildlife habitat. And so we do a lot of monitoring and assessment work, as well as some restoration research work. And we actually recently hired a pollinator biologist who will be advancing a lot of our assessment work, especially the impacts of prairie restorations on pollinators. So diving in to Washington County, we're going to focus on some of our active restoration projects in the county. We've got 9 active sites, again, with a variety of landowner types. These total just under 3,000 acres, but not all of those acres are under active restoration or enhancement. But again, they cover forest, prairie, savanna, wetland, riverine habitats. They host a variety of rare species. And we've been really lucky to restore some important river frontage, as well as create new public access to the river, which we'll talk about a little more in detail when we get to those sites. So before we get into showcasing a few of the specific sites, which Laura is going to lead, I kind of wanted to provide a really simplistic view of our sort of restoration trajectory. So after we've done our prioritization, after we've done our site-specific planning, restoration often starts with removing invasive species. These have usually invaded as a result of a lack of disturbance or changes in the structure and function of the systems we live and work in. But this is almost sort of a given at any site. We're going to be starting with this. I'm curious, I don't know if this is the usual format, but I'd love folks to unmute if they can and take a guess at what we're looking at here. Anybody got any thoughts? It's shy group, that's okay.
Looks like you've mulched a bunch of buckthorn.
Absolutely, right? You're spot on. So this is a site where we've Got a really dense infestation of buckthorn. You can see that on the left side of the site. On the right side, we've done some forestry mowing. That's one of our common buckthorn removal methods. And so this is kind of an in progress buckthorn removal via forestry mower. Spot on, gold star. So next, once we've removed invasive species, we've taken care of other issues like nutrient enrichment, erosion problems, tree disease. Then we can turn to returning native species through seeding and planting. This is an example of that from one of our sites along the Mississippi River, actually in North Minneapolis. And then while that's certainly part of the battle, we know that especially in urban areas, these sites are going to take a lot of continual maintenance. And one of the best ways we can do that is by bringing back historical disturbance regimes and processes that really maintain these natural systems. So we do that through grazing, prescribed burning, et cetera. This is an example of one of our large site burns in Elk River. And then lastly, we're not restoring these sites in a vacuum. We know that these sites are within the systems in which we live, work, and play, and we need to create interest in caring for these places. And we can do that by engaging the community through education and through volunteering. So we have a volunteer component at almost every one of those 42 restoration sites that we work on. And volunteers help us take care of tasks that are either too small for contractors or too large for our ecologists. And this photo is from a volunteer work day last summer. This would be really impressive, but does anybody have a guess of where this site is in Washington County?
Great Cloud Dunes.
Oh my gosh, what am I even doing here? You guys could do this presentation for me. That's perfect. It's Great Cloud Dunes Scientific and Natural Area, which is one of the sites we've worked at for many years. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura now to get into some of these specific sites and some of the interesting projects we have going on.
Thanks, Alex. So we're going to start at one of our smallest sites in Washington County, and that is Settlers Island. If folks are familiar with that, it is a City of Cottage Grove owned park, which is located near Great Cloud Dunes in the Great Cloud Slough, which is a back channel of the Mississippi. This site, although it is pretty small at 3 acres, has a variety of habitats, and it's a pretty interesting spot despite its size. And it contains primarily floodplain forest and some pockets of true wetland that's seasonally flooded, but again, really interesting habitat. As is our typical process, as Alex mentioned, FMR wrote an NRMP, a Natural Resources Management Plan for the site in 2018, and then brought funding for restoration work to begin through the Outdoor Heritage Fund. And then that restoration began in 2019, and we've just now finished our sort of initial phase of restoration work. So this is primarily what the site looked like before restoration. And again, any guesses what we're seeing here? Anything that sort of sticks out to people? I'll just jump
first.
Yeah, buckthorn forest, exactly. And the understory is completely dominated by common buckthorn. Very little, if any, native understory, no herbaceous layer to speak of. And although it's not obvious in this photo, that's just sort of looking at the subcanopy, there is very little tree regeneration here. The canopy was really dying off in part due to emerald ash borer and ash being a dominant tree species on the island in the past. So it's kind of 2 things at play here in terms of restoration, needing to determine not only how to get rid of the buckthorn on an island, which is floodplain, but also how to revegetate the site and restore the site's canopy. So lots of things to consider in terms of its restoration trajectory. So in addition to the poor vegetation community in and of itself, this lack of understory vegetation allowed soil and other nutrients on the site to freely enter the river during flood events, which were pretty common. So our work started with volunteers because we did not have funding initially at the beginning of the project. And so between our stewardship volunteers and also the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa crews, we undertook high stumping of buckthorn, and that's essentially removing the canopy of the buckthorn plant. So we're at that point stopping the production of fruits and additional seed into the seed bank. So although we're going to have to deal with some resprouts in the future, it's sort of pressing a pause on the buckthorn and production of that new seed. And this was an initial low-cost step that we could implement while we were pursuing that state funding to do more substantial work. There we go. So then after the high stumping, we did some light seeding on the site and then enjoyed a really amazing flush of native grasses and wildflowers that were just coming back from the seed bank, as well as some weedy species. And this was great because at the beginning of the project, we could hold soil in place. And then that grassy understory could provide some competition for the buckthorn seedlings that were coming up from the seed bank, and was also providing some habitat benefits that were previously lacking at the site. So a pretty different condition just 1 year into the project. We still didn't have many tree species regenerating, however, so we hosted 2 tree and shrub planting events in 2020 to establish the site's future canopy. FMR is staying present at the site as well through ongoing monitoring for the city of Cottage Grove, and we've been really pleased to see some excellent survival of this planting in particular. What we tried to do on Settlers Island was to focus on climate adapted tree species, both near natives like the sycamore that is more common and native just at the south of Minnesota, and then also just more southerly grown specimens of the natives that are currently here, like hackberry, for example. The gradual loss of regeneration of eastern cottonwood, for example, in our floodplains has been documented. And American sycamore is a really good analog to that species because of its similar structure, but sycamore happens to be more resilient to warmer temperatures that we'll see through climate change, as well as longer duration flooding that the cottonwoods just really are not tolerating. And then lastly, at Settlers Island, public access to the site is also really important. And so we worked with the city to make the site accessible to the public through installation of a gravel canoe launch and picnic pad. And the site is now a stopover on the water trail that encircles Great Cloud Island. The next site we'd like to focus on is just east of Highway 61 on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. Here you'll find Camel's Hump Park and open space. It's just here on the screen. This is another City of Cottage Grove owned park, but a little bit larger at 60 acres. And it also packs some really diverse habitats into a relatively small area with both remnant bluff prairies and oak savannas, as well as oak forests. Again, FMR completed a natural resources management plan for the park in 2014 to guide that restoration work. As is true on many sites, it can be difficult to see the native forest for the buckthorn trees that have become established in just even the last 30 to 40 years. That was also true at Camel's Hump. There were glimpses of remnant native plant communities along the steep bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, but there were also these large bur and white oaks that told a story of this past oak savanna that might have stretched along this corridor. On other areas of the bluff, eastern red cedar and some non-native honeysuckles had established because historic disturbances like fire had been removed from the site. But still remnant worm-season bunch grasses like little bluestem shown here were still hanging on because of little bluestem's shade tolerance, for example. The steepness of these bluffs is really what saved these prairies because they couldn't have been tilled or likely only lightly grazed. But when we can bring disturbance like fire back to a site, we start to see these native plant communities return, either from the seed that's being transported from nearby remnants, or we can supplement that regeneration through careful and really targeted seeding that very closely mimics nearby remnants. These bluffs with their sandy soils and limestone bedrock are also especially prone to erosion and soil loss. So our restoration work on these bluffs is typically phased, so that we can work to remove woody invasive species in one area and let that site recover from disturbances like fire before woody removal and disturbances can be initiated in other areas of the site. I'll let Alex take this next one.
All right, thanks, Laura. I'll jump back in to talk about Cottage Grove Ravine Regional Park. I hope everybody is familiar with this park. This is a really amazing site. It's an example for us of sort of large scale site planning and implementation of a project involving a number of different partners. So FMR wrote a natural resource management plan for just the south half of the site back in about 2013, and we've been implementing that ever since. And then as part of sort of a more recent master planning process, FMR partnered with South Washington Watershed District and wrote an updated management plan for the entire site. And so we've really been able to work with a lot of great partners in order to implement these planning and restoration projects. I mentioned South Washington Watershed District. I think Tony might be on this call. We've got Washington Conservation District and Dan McSwain and others at Washington County Parks. So I know these next two maps are going to be a little bit small. I don't need you to read into every little detail. I believe these are also available on the Washington County Park website. But this is kind of a quick view of some of the results of our management planning processes. And on the left, we've got a map showing our target plant communities for restoration on the site. On the right, we've got a map showing sort of the restoration priorities, and those priorities take into account the sort of needed timeframes, as well as the funding requirements and the ease of restoration for some of those communities. So as far as targets go, we've got a lot of oak forest, some oak savanna, that's sort of in the sort of reddish brown and more orangey on the left map, as well as some prairie as a target in the north half of the site, that's that yellow color. And then in terms of priority, on the right map, you can see that in blue, those are all of our areas that have been under active or past restoration. And the highest priority areas moving forward are in pink. And we've actually started tackling some of those areas as recently as this past winter. So FMR has again been able to bring quite a bit of outdoor heritage funding to this site, a few $100,000 over the past few years to implement this work. And that's already in addition to work that county park staff and crews have done. And then South Washington Watershed District and Washington Conservation District have done a lot of work in the drainage easement that runs north-south through this site. You can kind of see, if you squint your eyes really close, there's a really light blue outline of the drainage corridor that runs through the site. Restoration of that has tied in really nicely with the rest of the restoration that we've been able to do, and ensures that we get even more water quality benefits at the site. So what has this process looked like? Well, it looks a lot like what we've already shown. We started a lot with invasive woody removal. We've done that on a couple hundred acres of oak forest and woodland at the site. We've done various methods at this site. It's been a combination of forestry mowing, including mowing places multiple times. We've done cut and paint removal. We've used goats, and we've engaged volunteers to do both brush hauls and follow-up seeding. And it's all with the goal of transitioning these areas from conditions like the one on the left, where we have this really dense, impenetrable thicket of buckthorn that's hampering wildlife, that has negative effects on birds, negative effects on soil, negative effects on water quality through increased erosion and nutrient loss. And we're transitioning that to more like we see in the right photo, where we've got a more open, diverse woodland, and then bringing back native cover to better hold soil, filter nutrients, and provide habitat. We've also done some remnant bluff prairie expansion and restoration. And actually this photo is from January and February of this year. We've been pushing back some woody encroachment and returning prescribed fire to some of these spots. So we're really excited about kind of opening up some of the rare and remnant habitat on this site. And of course, I mentioned goats, so I got to at least show those little PR stars. So in an effort to reduce herbicide use, park staff and FMR have been trialing goats mostly for follow-up buckthorn control and control of garlic mustard and some other herbaceous species. But the key is that this isn't new. People have been using goats for restoration for a number of years now, but tracking their effects and figuring out the proper timing and duration is something that folks are still working on. And so we're tracking that both at Cottage Grove Ravine Park, and I know county staff is doing that elsewhere, in order to better understand their effects and create some best practices for restoration. But here's a sort of side-by-side of their work in one of the oak forest units. As long as they're deployed for multiple years, goats can do a good job of dealing with buckthorn seedlings and resprouts. But, as with any of the sites we've shown, this really does need to be paired with follow-up seeding and planting to bring back a complement of native understory species. Back to Laura.
Thanks, Alex. So again, we'll move upstream, and this will be one of our corporate properties that we worked on. This happens to be the Marathon Bluffland property, a privately owned restoration site. The corporate property covers about 173 acres. We're currently working on about 35 acres of that property. And the Natural Resources Management Plan for this property was drafted in 2016. And then Marathon Company began to fund restoration work in 2022. So this is pretty early stages of restoration. The oak woodlands and remnant prairies on the property are under active restoration, but Marathon is also considering this site as a use for potential outdoor classroom or community education space. So again, a similar story here. At Marathon, we were faced with another wall of buckthorn in the understory of these beautiful oak woodlands. And then following 2 seasons of forestry mowing to remove that invasive understory, the property is almost unrecognizable to what it used to be. And with its stately oaks released as the images on the right of the screen show. A lot of follow-up treatment still is needed, and we are working to reestablish native herbaceous cover in the woodlands, but we think we can get there, so we're pressing on. Similarly, the remnant bluff prairies at the property had really changed with woody incursion and the lack of fire on the site. So following some hand cutting of much of the woody species, a prescribed burn and some very targeted seeding has allowed the site to start to begin to reach back to that structure of that's more indicative of a dry prairie. After 1 year of management, we started to see 3 species of blazing star, flowering spurge, pussy toes, the more uncommon hairy hawkweed, and also cream gentian. And we're really excited to see what else shows up in the coming year. And Alex will take this next one.
And this is another sort of corporate property example, and I think the last site that we're going to cover. But this is the 3M property, also in Cottage Grove, just south of Highway 61. Another example of a really long-term corporate partnership. FMR has been working with 3M for over 15 years at this site. And while the site is huge, it's over 1,800 acres, we're actively only restoring about 400. And that's mostly focusing on prairie with some forest and streambank habitat too. So, we keep tackling more acres each year. This is another example where we can engage the public through yearly volunteer events at a site that they otherwise can't see on their own, which has been a really interesting and rewarding process. And this is also a site where we've documented lots of rare species use, mostly bird use of our restorations. And finally, are conducting some sort of small scale restoration research experiments at the site, which I'll touch on briefly as well. So a lot of the restoration at the site looks like this, where we're transitioning either active or fallow ag and pasture land to diverse native prairie. The photo on the right is an example of a restoration in what we call the western draw of the site. This is a spot where we've been able to establish over 40 species of grasses and wildflowers on over 80 acres that was all fallow pasture land. And another recent interesting project at this 3M site is another example of a partnership project, which is the restoration and stabilization of the East Ravine at the site. This is the same stream channel that flows through Cottage Grove Ravine Park to the north. And this was another South Washington Watershed District project that FMR partnered on. And we were able to oversee the sort of maintenance of the streamside and upland habitat. We handled invasive plant removal, some seeding and maintenance. And this was all in accordance with an evaluation of the site that we conducted in 2017. So I mentioned before that we're tracking the effects of our restoration. We have a lot of long-term data on the successes of our restoration in terms of their ability to support wildlife. And Karen Schick, another one of FMR's ecologists who isn't on the presentation today, but who many of you know, she maintains long-term breeding bird survey data at a lot of our sites, including at Cottage Grove Ravine Park and at 3M. And while some of the sites we're showing here on the graph are actually from across the river in Dakota County, they illustrate the effects that our prairie restorations are having on bird populations. And so you'll see we have pre-restoration data, those are the bars in blue, and post-restoration data, those are the bars in orange. And at all of these prairie sites, we've really seen dramatic increases in not only the number of species, these are bird species, but also the number of individuals using these sites. And so in this case, we're looking only at species of greatest conservation needs. So this is a subset of all the species, and you can see a lot of those species listed there. These are mostly grassland species. You know, grassland birds have experienced precipitous population declines, and they really depend on diverse prairie and grassland habitat for survival. And so while some of these numbers are more dramatic than others, you can see at 3M, which is the 2 bars all the way to the right side of the graph, we've seen an 18% increase in these species of greatest conservation need using our restorations, which is really gratifying. And then lastly, at 3M, we have this ongoing restoration research experiment, which we do at a variety of our sites. This one in particular focuses on methods to control invasive honeysuckle. And so like buckthorn, I'm sure you're all familiar, honeysuckle can be a bit of a bear to manage. It's often a little bit more resistant to removal methods and common herbicides. And so our experiment is now in its 3rd year, and it looks at combinations of variables like seasonality, herbicide type, and concentration, and 2 herbicide minimization methods, foam applications and dauber applications, so that we can really pinpoint the best control methods to not only maximize success at getting rid of honeysuckle, but also minimize non-target impacts. And I mentioned herbicide minimization at Cottage Grove Ravine Park. It's important to us not only because of the negative effects of herbicide on a lot of our sort of rare conservative plant species and systems, but also because a lot of the shallow depth to groundwater at these Washington County natural areas. So we're really cognizant of doing everything we can to restore habitat in ways that don't have unintended negative effects on water quality or habitat. So we do have some early results that we can share for this. I know that's kind of a niche topic. So if you are interested, feel free to either ask a question or reach out to this if anyone's interested. Laura, I'll toss it back to you to wrap it up.
Thanks, Alex. So just really quickly, because we are getting close to the end of our time, we just want to sort of say generally that all of this restoration work, the overarching goal here is resiliency. When a native plant community can be reestablished, we're regaining improved habitat for birds, mammals, pollinators. And then these plant steep root systems work to stabilize soils, infiltrate water, and reduce erosion. Also, the provision of several blooms throughout the growing season ensure food resources and kind of a wide range of seasonal conditions, whether we go through a wet period or a dry period. And then you also just have to admit that native plants are just really beautiful and add a lot to a landscape. I can say just really quickly that we continue to be focused on measuring the results of our restoration in upland areas. And we can even do that in monitoring stream and invertebrate populations. That's something that we've been working with primarily on the Vermilion River outside of Washington County a little bit. But just showing here that to prove this point about improvements to habitat and water quality come from upland restoration action. Just to sort of summarize what you're seeing here on the screen, some 2020 fish data was collected at 4 stations along the Vermilion River, with 2 stations located both upstream and downstream of one of our upland restoration projects. And as you can see here, a really significant difference between the upstream and downstream locations of the restoration area. And from the fish survey, we are just hoping that a lot of these fish, a lot of the trout population from this survey are recruiting into new habitat. Just really quickly, I want to share a few pieces of information about how you can get involved with FMR. We have a really robust volunteer program that seeks out stewardship of the community, and you can find out information about those events on our website. You can sign up for our biweekly newsletter, Mississippi Messages, You can become a river guardian and do advocacy at the state capitol. Also become a member of FMR, and then also follow us, like us on social media. And again, we're happy to take any questions now or at the end of our time together. And Alex and my contact information is here on the screen.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Alex and Laura. Are there any questions for our speakers? Not seeing any immediately, but I do have a global question kind of for both of you. So you both spoke quite a bit about your volunteer work. And in my own work, I've kind of noticed that there's a lot more local drives to improve local areas or immediate surroundings. And this has certainly, for me, been a little bit more pronounced post-pandemic. I'm just kind of curious if you've noticed a similar movement towards caring for microenvironments with your volunteer programs, and if so, how you kind of tailored your programming to capitalize on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that, Tom. Thanks for the question. You know, FMR is really intentional about recruiting volunteers from the communities in which our sites are sited. And, you know, we're all about creating sort of local bandwidth and excitement for these sites. And so while FMR certainly has a lot of sort of return customers in terms of volunteers who just want to work with us wherever we're working, we do a lot of that outreach in the community to make sure we're getting neighbors and friends and partners from around these sites. We certainly experienced no downturn in interest in volunteering during the pandemic, and quite the opposite. Like you said, people really kind of embrace the opportunity to get outside and help us restore these places. For those familiar with FMR's volunteer program, we do about 100 to 150 public and group events each year. And these events fill up really, really quickly. So we have had a really great, robust interest in getting outside and helping these sites. And I think just briefly, as I mentioned at the beginning too, we're seeing a lot more drive to take ownership of people's backyards, people's local natural areas, especially when these might be outside of some of the larger parks or other properties that are getting attention from municipalities. And so that's why we have been driven to sort of create this volunteer-centric management planning process that is going well in Minneapolis. We're trialing this at 3 sites and are 2 years into 2 of the projects. But it's another example, I think, of what you mentioned, just people's drive to get involved and do good in their backyards.
Great, thanks, Alex. Mike, did you have a question?
I do, thank you. On your one project area, you were talking about the buckthorn control, and for me, as maybe like the first half of my career, so I was involved with a lot more conservation work as an SWCD employee version in Wisconsin, and I look at the scale of things, and so when we look at forestry and the scale of this problem, it's pretty massive. So do you have data on those 3 methods that you were describing, and or if there's a combination that's presently working best? Because I say I have more than a casual interest in this topic, as have had goats at my place, but I was grazing them for somebody that was doing that work. So and just from a land manager standpoint.
Definitely. And Laura, feel free to chime in if I miss anything. We have a restoration site down in Hampton, Minnesota, across the river, called the Hampton Woods Wildlife Management Area. It's a DNR WMA, where we've been restoring about 200 acres of pretty buckthorn packed woodlands. And we actually did a sort of factorial experiment looking at the effects of forestry mowing, follow-up treatments, multiple mows, cut and paint removal, and goats. And so we did produce a little white paper from that actually summarizes the data and is digestible and is meant to be shared with landowners. So I know Dakota County did a lot of sharing to their local SWCDs and other city partners. And so if that's something you'd like to see, we'd be happy to send that along. as everything is, it sort of is a little site dependent. We really don't see goats as a great first step tool. Goats are a great follow-up treatment. The price is coming down, so I think you'll see those continue to be popular, but a lot of people use it as a one-off, and it really needs to be sustained over multiple years, multiple deployments. But we have found that, you know, for economic reasons, forestry mowing is a great first step. At a lot of our sites, we tend to prefer 2 mows in back-to-back years, and then follow up with a little bit less herbicide use. But like I said, I can send you that report with the details, and for anyone else, maybe we could send that around as well. Laura, did you have anything else to add to that?
Only to say that, you know, I think there's sort of the suite of tools for buckthorn management, and we've had lots of success with most of the methods, and it ends up being really kind of context dependent, you know, based on the level of buckthorn invasion. If there are nicer conservative species that we're trying to protect, you know, we don't want to do forestry mowing if there's some, you know, remaining native shrub layer that could, you know, serve as regeneration. So in those areas, we're doing, you know, the more expensive methods of hand cutting and treating stumps. Like Alex said, you know, if we have really mature buckthorn that's dominating a woodland, it doesn't make sense to bring goats in because they're really good at the smaller stuff that are they're kind of the follow-up methods. And, you know, if you have just a newer invasion that's mostly saplings and seedlings, that can be hand pulled or even mowed and then a follow-up foliar treatment. We're also seeing some really great success in a couple of our Minneapolis sites where there's been an ongoing herbicide ban, and we're using the sort of like we showed on Settlers Island, the high stump method where we're cutting the canopy and then we're following up with removing any overgrowth or regrowth from those stumps. And over the course, if that's consistent over the course of a couple of years, that buckthorn, and even, you know, kind of 3 and 4 inch diameter buckthorn is dying off, and you can essentially just pull it out of the ground at that point with 0 herbicide use. So lots of different methods that are, you know, kind of, I think best selected based on the site.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any last questions for our speakers? All right, thank you, Alex and Laura.
Thank you.
So next up this afternoon, we have Mike Kinney, District Administrator with Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District, who will be telling us about Bone Lake Northeast wetland restoration. Take it away, Mike.
All right, thanks, Tom. Are you able to see my screen there? Looks good. Okay. Yes, thank you. So I'm going to highlight one particular project here, but the overall topic really is a much larger, you know, probably statewide, regional, or even national kind of issue. So this has been a process of, I guess, observation, data analysis, and a mixed bag of my background that's kind of come into play here to develop this sort of process for identifying what I'm referring to here as legacy loads. So, when we look at the historical land use, there were a very large number of farms in the state of Minnesota, and of course, you know, the upper Midwest around, and often our grandparents or great-great-grandparents needed to have their livestock get some water early on. You know, in those early years, they sited their buildings near a water source, a wetland, creek, or lake, or anything like that. So it's very understandable, because even during the winter months, you could just break the ice and then go and get a drink of water prior to well development. So we had a lot of these sites around the state, and it's not just farms, but they are the predominant version of this. And so these sites then have, while many of them no longer exist because of ongoing changes in our landscape, physically and, you know, economically and otherwise, the activity or the results of the activity of that agriculture remains in many occasions. So we're located in northern Washington County, in southern Chicago County. District is roughly 49 square miles. It includes a couple different municipalities, LGUs, townships as well. And of course, there's our mission statement. The site is located in the northeast part of Bone Lake in our what we refer to as the Bone Lake Management District. And we have split the district into 4 lake management districts just from a sort of a process or flow standpoint. Again, recognizing that watershed districts are independent of artificial boundaries of government, and watershed districts represent the watershed boundaries itself. And so this one from Bone Lake then drains through this little comfort drainage area, then out into Comfort Lake, and then Sunrise River, and then to the St. Croix River, and ultimately down to Mississippi. So this project site here, being a longtime person of interest in both family history and in local history, I'm a lifelong member of a historical society, and just what thinking about. Just what we, in the last presentation, we were trying to restore back to, land conditions prior to a lot of these invasives and other things that have happened. So I often try to think about, well, what did things look like prior to European settlement, and then how do we're not going to get things back to exactly the same thing, but how do we then, but looking through that lens and thinking of the transition and such. So I had a resident on the lake here not far away contact me, and I don't know if it was like 2017 or 2018, about a large amount of Eurasian water milfoil in that particular location. There's a very small tributary in there, and we were monitoring a culvert at the road, not at the actual inlet, because there was a field where this gold star is. So that's what we were of more interest in. So and it was easier to monitor at that culvert rather than just the where it flowed into the lake, just through what we thought was a benign wetland. And but during that conversation, because Eurasian milfoil has a tendency to be connected with nitrogen, and I commented, said, "Boy, that's really surprising." Because we'd already we stabilized the field. The district, it's actually a site of interest. We have been renting it from the landowner or the family. It had been an absentee landowner for 50 years. The farm had been just rented out year to year, and so it had a really serious erosion problem. So we took over the rent and stabilized it, and that's again demonstrated to be a very cost-effective method for reducing nutrients and sediment into the water body there. But in between was this small wetland, and she said, "Well, there used to be a dairy farm over there in that corner, but there are no buildings that represent a farm over there at all." So I went back and looked at the aerial photography, and sure enough, in this 1964 photo, if you were to zoom in on it, you can see the cows in the barnyard adjacent to that wetland. And if you looked at the land, you can see that there was a draw, and all of that area was flowing into that wetland. So we went and took some samples, and lo and behold, they were elevated. So here's kind of a summary of the whole project. It was really to remove this manure-laden sediments that were in the wetland from that source. And if you look at the before condition, there's no farm there, right? You drive by and you just see a wetland. So these things are kind of hidden in plain sight, if you will. And I believe that they exist all over the state by the hundreds. So maybe even thousands. So not the biggest project we've done. We've done several of these already, and we've got another project very similar to this already lined up. We have the grant, we have the landowner permission, and we are looking to do that project on another small farmstead that abuts or is immediately adjacent to a lake. In fact, when the lake gets a little bit higher, it floods the barn a little bit, so you can get an idea how close that one is. And still within the lifetime cost, a very cost-effective project. So overall, we start with what we call sequential diagnostic monitoring, and so this is an effort currently not funded by Bowser, and I was hoping that maybe Bowser staff would be on here so I could pick on them a little bit, but I really feel that this is an area that because they just say, well, we don't want to fund monitoring. Well, baseline monitoring of lakes is completely different than sequential diagnostic monitoring. Those are completely different efforts, if you will, with respect to data analysis and trend analysis. The data used out of this is used very differently. So the idea is you started the tributary where it enters a water body, and you kind of leapfrog your way up, and you can just do some really broad spectrum analysis initially to see if any one, say there's a half a dozen tributaries entering a lake, if one is or two are much higher than the rest in terms of concentration and load, then those are the ones that you would want to look at, more closely. And so this is the process we've used, and then in combination, then we'll take the data, we'll do the appropriate modeling to see, how those are teased out. But modeling alone will never get you these answers because they're not going to be able to see these particular sites using all the assumptions that are in any of the models that are out there. And I've done enough modeling. I know that it's all about the assumptions in there, and they're built on these really I guess broad data sets that are not going to help you identify a single one of these types of projects. So with that, then, we've developed more than the practice of looking at aerial photography, and then also these interviewing, and that was kind of something that sort of was more by accident that I started, and I've done this for many years, has been to seek out some of the longest time residents in an area and have conversations with them about what they remember the landscape to be like, or what they remember the lake to be like, et cetera. And it often provides some level of insight. And sometimes they'll have photos or family stories. Another great source is actually your public library, about books about early settlers and conditions of that area, that are documented in different books, or your local historical society. So all of these are additional resources to do research from a management side. So not a traditional source, if you will, for data or information, but still very valuable in helping you determine, what was your original condition, and then can you get back to something close to that, or any nuances in that. Other such things, you could do climate reconstruction, just like we've done in some of our lakes, to establish what the historical water body was like, 150 years ago or so. And we've used the St. Croix Watershed Research Station to help facilitate us in that understanding. So that's some of the broad use or tools that we've used to try to get that information. So I mentioned the sub-watershed analysis, the SWA modeling here, that these do not consider that historical land use data, and as a result are just simply not capable of identifying these types of projects. There's just no mechanism. So they have their purpose, but without the data to actually calibrate the model, I think they fall quite short. And given how much emphasis that the state gives on utilizing these models, I have been trying to lobby them to think differently about that approach, because at least from our experience now, we're roughly 93% towards our goals of our 6 impaired lakes, and roughly an 8-year period. So tracking towards something that's probably about 1/7 of the time frame and 1/5 of the cost compared to what we're seeing elsewhere. This resident outreach, again, it's really an important key and element. And for somebody like me, it's pretty easy and natural because I just love to go out and talk to farmers and landowners and stuff. So it's doing a cold call and talking to people is not a big deal. I know it's not for everybody, but it's really important information to gather that understanding about what the historical aspect of the land was like, if at all possible. The other, if you're not familiar with it, is all the aerial photography is stored right on the University of Minnesota's website through this website here. You can access it. Great resource, really fun to look at. I think to see how much transition there's been in areas over time. And again, so here's the kind of look at it. And if you look way over to the right, you can see in that barnyard those cows right there adjacent to that wetland. And it's really amazing that, look at all those buildings and everything, and not a single one of them is there anymore. And that's also that adaptive management, if you will, in our landscape. So, something that really surprised me that to know that there was something of that size, as well as just the activity across to the north there and how dry all that is, because now a lot of that is very wet ground and not being farmed. So the sequential diagnostic monitoring, I described this a little bit, but it's really, in this example, 4 tributaries, and we're trying to find that one really, we're just evaluating, this, assuming something that, well, it doesn't even need to be an impaired water body, but one that maybe is approaching that, and you're just trying to verify, and you want to maintain a good water quality. But most likely for impaired water bodies, this is a process where you start sampling near the inputs and you work your way upstream, and you will. Sometimes these sources can be more ubiquitous, so meaning that it's a large wetland complex, and the wetland complex, because it's drained or otherwise or altered, may be going through some sort of cycling and releasing of phosphorus. It's not necessarily always an exact project site like that, but depending on the nature of the landscape, this would get you there potentially fairly quickly, and have a better understanding. Because another project we did northwest of Moody Lake in Chisago County, that one single site, that was there was a wetland in which there was roughly 100 cow a dairy operation in which there were about 100 livestock or so, and there was a concrete feed bunk and 10% slope from that to the wetland. And every time there was a rain, the farmer even told me, who's now long retired, it was him and his dad. They said, "Oh yeah, rained all that manure. The whole concrete was clean right off. It was great." Well, it went right down into the wetland. It was a massive source, and it was 78% of the load going into Moody Lake, just one site. So that's just another example. And along with that, so part of when I first started, part of my background goes a little bit. So my undergrad's in geology, my master's in water resources, but I started as a business major because my dad was a banker and a dairy farmer, so I thought I was going to do the same thing. And so I have a strong interest in economics and finance and accounting and stuff. So the Pareto principle, if you're familiar with that as well, so that's an economic principle, but it's also one that's core to kind of lean Six Sigma analysis, which industry uses to really focus on finding efficiencies in their enterprises. So I feel that there's no reason why government can't do the same thing. And then within the water resources world, this model fits into that quite well. So we, after that initial, getting permission from the landowner, We went out, took these wetland soil corings and determined that there was a high concentration of phosphorus in these wetland soils, well above natural background levels, and that they were in fact discharging to the lake. So just last year, then we did the construction, and it was a physical removal of all of those nutrients. We did enough coring to establish the extent of the highest load, and then received the necessary permitting to physically remove it. And of course, this is a type of work that needs to be done in the wintertime under frozen conditions. Field that we rent, which happened to be very light sandy soil and was very low in organic matter because it had been farmed so heavily or intensively for the last 50 years on row crops, and very low in pH. So I was have done 20-some thousand acres of nutrient management planning, and I had up until that time had never seen a field with a pH that was that low, and so that was because of the intensity of the farming that was occurring. So there's a little photo journey of the project. First was just before, kind of, and these red dots kind of are give you an idea, like facing that same direction, but you can see the transition of removal and then the open water piece at the end. So that does provide a different type of habitat now in that wetland as well. And of course, the overall benefits to the project for Bone Lake, which again are cumulative because Bone Lake now is at the point where it's one of the last projects that we are prepared to petition the PCA to have it delisted. So, and then with this lake now being that much cleaner, it drains down and through several other lakes, which were also on the impaired waters list. So that's helping to improve those water bodies as well. So it's a sequencing. The one first lake we focused on was Moody Lake, which is flowed into Bone Lake, and now we're moving throughout the system. So, additionally, we took the sediment and took it out to this field, and then had the contractor spread it out about 3 or 4 inches, and then our intent is to continue to work that into a continuous cover. I'm trying to work something with the landowners, maybe with something longer term, so we could then invest in some native plantings and things like that as well. So just kind of in summary, this legacy of historical land use management kind of things that we're discussing here, it's not, while it's mostly going to be these farms, I did come across in a different time of my life a similar entity, but it was a mink farm on the edge of a wetland. If you've ever been near a mink farm, you know how they eat. The way they was operated was that you would bring in almost dead cattle, and then they would feed that protein to the mink for their fur. But the feces was extremely high in nutrients, and then under the cages. And this particular one was set on the edge of a wetland, so presumably so they could just push it in the feces into the wetland when they every time they needed to get it clean. And the other ones are potentially like there were many creameries around the state as well, and those often were located in close proximity. So depending on if they had any waste product, it could have gone into a local water body. So, but overall, these are just it's because right now most of our model, our water resources model, looks at things that are going on presently in the landscape in terms of the way it's being managed. And that's a very important component. So I'm not dismissing that at all. But the other thing that's really unseen are these legacy loads, due to past activities that are where the nutrient source is still there, very active in these wetlands or other areas, and contributing to long-term problems. And the other benefit really of these types of projects is that there's really no operation and maintenance costs, and they are permanent removals of nutrients. So, so that's, I mean, we could, in theory, make the cost per pound much lower by saying, oh yeah, it's good for 100 years or something. But in reality, that's what it is. It's a long-term solution and benefit to the resource at multiple layers. So that's it for my presentation. Now I guess stand for any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike? Just taking a look at the chat here. I'm not seeing any immediately. Mike, I do have a quick question. So, and I apologize if I missed this. So with the sequential diagnostic monitoring, have you found other places within Comfort Lake, Forest Lake watershed that have similar kind of features with wetlands that used to be historic, like manure pits that have been feeding nutrients into specific lakes?
Yes, so this was the second such project. We have a third that we have funded. Well, actually 2 that we have funded for. One is in the Moody Round Barn area. So, but that'll be less because probably most of it actually drained directly into the lake. So there's a smaller area that it would be a much smaller project in scale. So, but we have another, a 4th project that we have already identified and are working with the landowner on to get access to and permission before we submit for a grant application. So right. So just for our watershed district, there's 5 different such projects that we've identified thus far.
Great, thank you.
And those are ones that are just in immediate proximity to our water resource. We haven't really made an effort to go into, farther, more distant areas out to look at ones, because it's all about the proximity to the conveyance to a major water body. Not to say that restoring a single wetland doesn't have value by itself, but the priority is these sites in which the wetland water or the water body downstream has more potential to be immediately impacted. So there are probably other sites around the district, but this is our current focus.
Gotcha. Thank you. Any other questions for Mike? Any last rounds of questions for either of our speakers? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands immediately, but I do want to say thank you, everyone, and a very big thank you to our speakers, Alex, Laura, and Mike. Stay tuned for the survey that will be out next month, and then we'll see you again in August. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for participating.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care.